The wind carried sorrow like an old hymn, low and endless across the Wyoming highlands. Snow fell soft as feathers, hush-hushing the land beneath its weight, but it could not quiet the memory of gunfire. It could not bury the smoke that clung to the back of Wehopa's throat or scrub the red from her hands. The fire had long gone cold behind her, but the cries still rang in her ears, sharp, short things that had no right belonging to the voices she once loved. She did not look back. Her legs moved as if belonging to another woman, someone untouched, someone unbroken. The snow came up to her knees now, clinging to the hem of her elk-hide dress, freezing to her bare shins. She had long since lost one moccasin in the flight from the burning village, but the pain had dulled into a numb throb. She could feel the blood in her boot like warm sap. She was running out of warmth to give. In her arms, the child kicked, a small fluttering inside her. Not yet born, but already knowing danger, already learning the silence of survival. She kept one arm wrapped tight around the mound of her belly, as if to shield the child from the cold, the grief, the memory of what had happened just hours before. Wehopa, whose name once meant pretty snow among her people, did not cry. She had no tears left. They had gone with her sister's scream, with her brother's stillness, with the old man's voice pleading in Cheyenne for mercy. She had run until the trees blurred, until the moon tilted sideways in her vision. And now, beneath this vast and merciless sky, she walked. The forest opened ahead, a brittle grove of pine and birch. Branches bowed with frost. The wind dropped as she stepped between them, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She found a hollow there, where a tree leaned old and crooked over a dip in the snow. She knelt beside it, knees breaking through the crust of ice, hands digging into powder. Her breath came ragged now. Her body ached with something deeper than exhaustion. Her time had come. There was no stopping it. She looked up at the sky. No stars. Only that endless white, falling still and soft. Wehopa leaned against the tree, pressing her back to the bark, and let the pain come. It moved through her like thunder under the skin, low and rolling. She gritted her teeth, dug her fingers into the roots, and bore down. No midwife. No warm water. No herbs or chants or hands to hold. Only the tree, the snow, and the heartbeat of her unborn son. Minutes turned to hours. Or maybe hours turned to something longer. She could not say. When it was done, she did not scream. She only breathed, hoarse and raw, as the child slipped into the world with a cry that broke the hush like lightning breaks a still sky. She caught him before he could touch the snow. His skin was warm and slick and fierce in her arms. His mouth opened in protest, tiny lungs fighting the cold. She laughed. It startled her, this ragged thing from her throat. But it was laughter, born of pain and defiance. She cradled the boy against her chest, tore the edge of her dress to swaddle him, and whispered the first word he would ever hear. "Oh, he lives." She held him to her skin, curled around him like a shell, like bark around soft sapwood. The snow gathered on her shoulders, made her hair shimmer white, but she did not feel the cold. Not now. Not when he breathed against her collarbone, alive. Not when he quieted at the sound of her voice. And still, she did not cry. The tree above them groaned softly in the wind. A branch gave a brittle creak. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled once, then again. The forest did not speak otherwise. The pain in her side grew sharper now, an old wound opened anew. She pressed a hand to her hip and found warmth leaking between her fingers. Blood again, but this time her own. She knew enough to know she was slipping. Her eyes closed. She did not mean to sleep, not truly. But something heavier than rest pulled at her, like the arms of her ancestors come to carry her home. And then, a sound. Soft, crunching, measured. Boots in snow. She stirred but could not rise. Her body was a husk, emptied by birth and grief. Her hand tightened protectively around the child. Another sound, a breath drawn slow, uncertain. A voice, low and shaped by tobacco and silence. "Lord above." She tried to speak but could not summon the words. Footsteps came closer. The snow crunched louder now. A shadow fell over them, long and bending. Then hands, warm, broad, lifting her gently, with the caution of someone holding a broken bird. The child let out a wail, but the hands were steady. They did not flinch. "I got you, girl," the man said, and though she could not open her eyes, she heard something in his voice, something worn down but not cruel, not unkind. She smelled wood smoke on his coat, pine tar, dried leather. His arms were strong, but his touch was not. She felt herself lifted against his chest, and the warmth of his body bled into her skin. He wrapped a thick coat around them both. "You done enough," he whispered, more to the world than to her. "Let me carry what's left." And so Wehopa, who had run from death and given life beneath a winter sky, let herself be carried by a stranger. His name was Cyrus McCall, though she would not learn it until later. A man with a quiet house and a quiet heart. A widower who had buried more than he cared to count, who spoke little and asked for even less. He did not know her name. He did not need to. All he saw was a woman and her child, red against white, heat against cold. He brought them to his cabin, a small thing tucked into the elbow of the forest, windows like eyes half closed against the snow. Inside was warmth. Not much, but enough. A fire smoldered low in the hearth. He set her near it, laid the child in a wool-lined drawer padded with cotton scraps, and covered them both in quilts. She drifted in and out of the world. Sometimes she felt his hands clean her wounds. Sometimes she smelled broth, heard the creak of floorboards, the murmur of old hymns sung to no one in particular. Once, she woke to find him rocking the child in his arms, humming low and sweet. She watched him through slitted eyes. He did not look at her often, not out of avoidance, but out of respect, as if to see her fully would be to intrude, as if she were a fire too beautiful to stare at for long. Days passed like this, or nights. She could not always tell. But slowly, warmth returned to her fingers. Strength gathered in her limbs like sap rising with the thaw. She sat up one evening, the child nursing at her breast, and found him by the hearth, carving something small from wood. A horse, perhaps, or a bird. He looked over, startled, but only gently. "You're awake," he said. Then quieter. "Good." She watched him a long moment, then nodded once. Her voice came raspy, but certain. "You saved us." He shook his head. "Just found you." She touched the baby's cheek. "That's the same thing." He said nothing, but he smiled, just barely. It touched the edge of his mouth, the corner of his eyes. She did not know what would come next. The past had burned behind her. The future lay wrapped in the arms of an old man's kindness. But for now, in that small cabin, with snow falling gentle outside and firelight flickering gold across the walls, Wehopa rested. And her son breathed softly in her arms. Alive. Cyrus McCall had not spoken aloud in 3 days. He'd never kept track of such things before, but the silence had grown thick, like dust settling on old shelves. The cabin had learned to live without voices. It creaked in the cold, whispered in the wind, groaned softly as the stove breathed heat into its bones, but no words lived there. Not since Annie. Not since the child that had never seen spring. He stood at the edge of his small clearing, snow piled in soft waves around his boots, shovel in hand, splitting the packed drift with quiet determination. He didn't know what he was digging for, maybe roots, maybe time, but he had to keep moving. Stillness, in his experience, made sorrow louder. The trees were brittle with frost, bowing under the weight of winter. A raven watched him from a bare branch, tilting its head. Cyrus nodded to it without thinking. "I know," he murmured. The bird blinked once, then took flight, its wings cutting the hush with a whisper. That's when he saw them. At first, it looked like a bundle of blankets dropped beneath the bent pine. A forgotten sack, maybe. But something about the shape prickled the hair along the back of his neck. He moved toward it slowly, boots sinking with each step. The cold bit through his coat, but he didn't notice. When he reached the figure, he knelt. Steam curled faintly from the child's mouth, pressed tight to the woman's chest. The woman herself was barely breathing. Her lips were blue. Her skin, brown and blood-stained, looked wrong against the white. One eye half opened as he touched her shoulder. He had seen many things in his time, death mostly, but never this. Never a woman half dead beneath a tree, holding a living child with the fierce quiet of someone who refused to let go of the world, even as it let go of her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wonder where she'd come from, or who she might be. Some things didn't require explanation. He wrapped them both in his coat, lifted them gently against his chest. The child whimpered but didn't cry. The woman slumped into him, breath shallow, one hand still curled protectively over the infant. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than usual. The snow was deeper, the cold more vicious. But the weight in his arms felt right, like something placed there by a greater hand. Inside, the fire still burned, low and steady. He laid the woman on the cot by the stove, moved slowly, careful not to jostle the child. The room filled with the scent of snow-damp wool, iron, and pine. He pulled the drawer from the kitchen dresser, lined it with cotton scraps and an old lamb's wool shawl, and laid the baby in it. The little thing blinked up at him, dark eyes wide and unafraid. "Easy now," Cyrus murmured, brushing snow from the infant's brow. "You're safe. For now, anyway." The woman stirred. Her lips moved, but the sound didn't come. He fetched water, warmed broth, cleaned the wound on her hip with trembling hands. She didn't wake fully, only drifted in and out like wind through cracked shutters. He sat beside her until the fire burned low, watching the rise and fall of her breath. Her cheek rested against the pillow with a strange serenity, as though she'd already passed into another life and been called back mid-step. She was young, 30 maybe, but her face held the stillness of someone who had already seen the end and chosen to live anyway. The baby cried once during the night. Cyrus rocked him gently in his arms, pacing slow along the cabin's single room. He hummed a hymn he barely remembered. The child quieted. Snow tapped softly against the windows, like fingers asking to be let in. By morning, the woman sat upright. Cyrus paused, ladling porridge into a tin bowl. He didn't speak at first, just turned and set the bowl on the table near her. She looked at him, then at the child. Her gaze didn't waver. "You're safe," he said. Her voice, when it came, was cracked but certain. "What is this place?" "Just a home," he replied. "Mine." She nodded, slow and deliberate. The fire crackled. She tried to rise and winced, hand going to her side. "Don't push it," he said, reaching gently to help her sit back. "You were bleeding. Infections close behind wounds like that." She did not thank him. Not yet. Gratitude, he imagined, was too small a thing to offer when you didn't know what part of you had survived. He noticed, not for the first time, how beautiful her eyes were, like polished obsidian, sharp and unreadable. She wore her hair long, matted now with dried blood and snow, but regal in its frame around her face. "Name's Cyrus McCall," he said, offering it like bread across a table. She nodded again, said nothing. The child stirred. She reached for him, and Cyrus helped place the boy in her arms. She cradled him with the ease of someone born to it. "What's his name?" Cyrus asked, not expecting an answer. "Tahu," she said after a pause. Her fingers brushed his cheek. "It means he lives." Cyrus felt something tighten behind his ribs. "You saved him," she added, quieter. He shook his head. "Wasn't me who gave birth in a snowstorm." She looked at him a long time then, as if weighing him. "Why help me?" she asked finally. He didn't know how to answer. The truth was too long, too slow. So he said, "Seemed like the right thing." "Doesn't always matter," she said softly. "Right things still get punished." He didn't disagree. The days that followed passed in a rhythm not unlike healing. Cyrus went about his chores with an extra care. He chopped wood near the window so he could glance in and check on them. He cooked 3 meals instead of 2. He boiled cloth, mended her moccasin, and fixed the broken drawer where the baby now slept each night. The woman, Wehopa, she told him one dusk when the fire was bright enough to make her voice feel safe, spoke little, but never unkindly. She moved with a hunter's grace, even injured. She watched everything. The woods. The shadows. And she didn't smile. Not at first. But there were moments. When the baby gripped his finger. When the wind howled and she whispered a word in Cheyenne, ancient and strong. When he offered her coffee and she accepted without looking away. He never asked her what had happened. He didn't need to. Some nights, he heard her murmur in her sleep, words in a language that curled like smoke. He sat by the fire and listened, though he did not understand. Once she cried out, a single sharp breath, and he almost reached for her, but she stilled and he let her be. On the fourth day, she stood. Her legs shook, but she held fast. Cyrus was at the stove, stirring rabbit stew. He turned when he heard the creak of the floorboards behind him. You shouldn't. I need to move, she said simply. He nodded. She walked to the table, looked out the window. Snow still fell, soft and persistent. The world beyond the glass looked as it always had. Quiet. Unforgiving. Will they come? She asked. He didn't ask who. Maybe, he said. But they won't find you here. Not unless they know where to look. She pressed a hand to the glass. Once a fire starts, she said, the smoke always remembers the sky. Cyrus didn't understand, but he understood enough. He set the stew down in front of her, pushed a spoon toward her hand. She sat slowly, ate in silence. When the child cried, she rose without a word. He watched her cross the room, watched the way her body still moved like a wounded doe, cautious but ready to bolt. He found himself wishing she wouldn't run. On the sixth morning, she asked to go outside. He helped her into a coat, Annie's, still hanging near the door. It was too large, but warm. He offered her a scarf, and she took it. The air bit at their cheeks. Snow crunched underfoot. She walked slow, cradling Tahu in the crook of one arm. Her free hand skimmed the low branches as they passed, brushing away frost. Cyrus trailed beside her, not speaking. They reached the tree where he'd found her. She stopped there, staring at the place in the snow where her body had rested, now barely a dent in the white. She knelt beside it, despite the pain, bowed her head, whispered something into the air. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Cyrus stood back, giving her space. When she rose again, there was something steadier in her eyes. Not peace exactly, but anchoring. As they walked back to the cabin, she said, "This is a quiet place." He glanced at her. Too quiet sometimes. She considered that. It's better than the places where blood speaks louder than the wind. He didn't argue. That night, she added cedar chips to the fire. The scent filled the room. She sat near him, not touching, but close enough that he felt her presence like heat. He handed her a cup of tea. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're welcome." Outside, the snow began again. Inside, the silence between them shifted, not heavy now, but whole. Cyrus closed his eyes, let the warmth hold him. The woman and the child slept beside the hearth. He thought, for the first time in years, that the house felt lived in, and that maybe, just maybe, it would stay that way. The days began to braid themselves into something steady. Morning brought a soft light through frost-fogged windows, casting long fingers across the wooden floor. Cyrus rose early, always first, though he moved more quietly now. There was someone to share the silence with, and that changed its shape. He let the fire breathe back to life before she stirred. He boiled water, prepared oats, and tended the stove with the careful rhythm of a man who no longer believed in rushing. The cabin, once only functional, now bore the hush of domestic presence, faint echoes of movement, the smell of bread rising near the fire, the delicate weight of a child's laughter shaping the air. Wehopa moved with more strength as the days stretched into weeks. Her limp lingered, but she bore it like old warriors bore their scars, acknowledged, never apologized for. She said little, but her silence had shifted. Before, it was a wall. Now, it felt like water, still, deep, and willing to be shared if one was patient enough. Cyrus never asked her to speak of the raid, the blood, or the flight through snow. He knew that grief spoke only when it was ready and that pressing for truth often scattered it. He gave her space in the day, but in the evenings, they existed together. She sat near the fire, sewing small things, a pouch, a sleeve, a narrow band of beadwork along the cuff of the coat he had given her. He carved. Sometimes animals, sometimes spoons. He had not carved for pleasure since Annie died. Now he did it without thinking. They fell into routine without agreement. She cooked supper some nights, blending her spices into the stew, pressing flatbread by hand and laying it on the hearthstone to warm. Her food was sharp, fragrant, earthy. He learned the flavors of her world one bite at a time. In return, he taught her to bake. They shared flour and laughter when the dough stuck to her elbows. One afternoon, she brought him a length of braided twine, dyed with berry juice and soot. "For your knife," she said. He held it like a gift made of gold. Not because of its worth, but because she had made it with her own hands. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know." He looped it through the handle and tied it carefully, his hands larger, slower. She watched. When he was done, she reached out, touched the knot, then returned to stirring the pot. She began venturing into the woods again. Short distances. At first, she took only the child in a sling across her back. Later, she asked if Cyrus would walk with her. They found tracks together: rabbit, fox, deer. She moved with the instinct of someone raised by land, her steps precise, her senses alert. He marveled at how she listened, not just with her ears, but her whole body. She taught him, without ceremony, how to watch the branches, how to feel snow underfoot for hidden movement. Tahu grew quickly. The child's eyes were bright, curious. His laugh came easy when Cyrus made odd noises or held him upside down for just long enough to make Wehopa narrow her eyes in warning. She didn't scold, but she held the boy tighter afterward. The boy's tiny fingers often curled around Cyrus's thumb. He would lie still for minutes at a time, just watching the man's face as if trying to memorize him. Cyrus had not held a child in decades. Not since the one who came too early, who never opened her eyes. Annie had buried the baby behind the house, under the tree that bloomed wild violets in spring. He never went back to that spot without a hammering in his chest. But now, when he held Tahu, the old ache seemed to settle, as though a long wailing note had finally resolved. Some evenings, Wehopa would sing to the child. Soft lullabies in a tongue Cyrus didn't understand but came to love. He didn't ask for translation. It was enough to hear the melody, the rise and fall of vowels shaped by 1,000 winters. They weren't lovers. Not yet. Not in word, not in body. But something formed in the space between them that was more than kinship and deeper than mere survival. A trust. A choosing. Quiet, as all true things begin. One night, she sat near the hearth, her legs folded under her, Tahu asleep in the drawer beside her. The fire cast her in amber. Cyrus worked beside her, sanding the curve of a ladle, though his eyes drifted often. She looked up at him. "You had a wife." It was not a question. He nodded. "Long time ago." "Did she die here?" "In the spring. Fever. Took her fast." "And the child?" He swallowed. "Before that. Born too small." She didn't make a sound. Wehopa closed her eyes. The ones who pass before they speak are still remembered. He nodded again, grateful for the way she said it. Not with pity. With reverence. Silence returned, but it was soft, like a blanket draped over them both. Days passed. The snow began to thin. Patches of bare earth emerged near the edges of the forest. Ice clung stubbornly to the river, but the wind changed. Birds returned in the mornings, trilling uncertainly. Cyrus watched Wehopa bend over the garden bed, brushing snow aside to test the soil with her fingers. She smiled faintly. "It's almost time," she said. "For planting. For choosing." He didn't ask what she meant. He only watched her touch the earth like it was something holy. Later that same day, a visitor came. May Caldwell, who lived 2 ridges over, arrived with her mule cart stacked with eggs, jerky, and gossip. She was near 70, sharp-eyed despite the cloudy film on one iris. She took one look at Wehopa and said, "So, this your house now?" Wehopa didn't flinch. "For now." May cackled. "Good. It needed warming." Cyrus offered tea, and May sat like she owned the place. "You gonna tell me what happened?" she asked, eyes on Wehopa. "No." May grunted approval. "Fair." The old woman watched Cyrus and Wehopa move around each other, their quiet ways, the ease of hands passing bowls, the glance exchanged when the baby stirred. "Well," she muttered, finishing her cup, "this ain't how I thought your story would go, McCall. But it's better than watching you die standing up." She left them with a wink and a tin of molasses biscuits. After she left, Wehopa sat at the table, fingering one of the biscuits. "She's strange." "She's right," Cyrus said. "About you dying?" He smiled. "About it being better this way." She didn't smile back, but her eyes softened. That night, it snowed again. Not heavy. A farewell dusting. Wehopa stood at the door, Tahu in her arms, looking out. "I could leave," she said. "You could. You wouldn't stop me." "No. But you'd want me to stay." "Yes." She looked at him then, truly looked. "You're not afraid of ghosts, Cyrus McCall?" "No. I just live with them." She nodded, stepped forward, pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder. Then she went to bed. The fire burned low. Cyrus sat alone, carving slowly, watching shadows dance. He did not follow her. Not yet. The next morning, she served him bread, fresh, brown, still warm from the hearth. "You didn't ask." "Didn't need to." She poured tea, sat across from him. "We stay until spring," she said. "Then we plant. And if nothing comes to take us, we stay again." He nodded, the lump in his throat making speech difficult. Tahu gurgled from his basket. Cyrus reached over, stroked the child's hair. "We'll make room," he said. "There's already room," she replied. And with that, something unspoken settled into the cabin like a seed pressing into soil. Small, quiet, full of unseen promise. The thaw came slow, like a man returning after too many years away. It loosened the grip of winter inch by inch, revealing beneath the snow the rough bones of the land. Muddy paths, broken branches, and the scattered evidence of lives lived quietly through the cold. Shoots of green pressed upward through the melting crust. The air carried birdsong now, cautious but insistent. Spring had not fully arrived, but it was close enough to believe in. Wehopa stood near the riverbank, her son tied snug against her back in a shawl dyed with walnut and birch. The wind threaded her braids, carrying the scent of water and soil. She watched the ice shift along the stream's spine, breaking with soft groans. Each crack sounded like the end of something old. Cyrus stood nearby, mending a fence rail. He worked without looking up, but he felt her watching him. They had grown used to this rhythm, working within sight of each other, saying little, sharing the sound of crows and wind through pine. She stepped toward him, boots sinking slightly in the thawed earth. Tahu stirred on her back, murmured a soft complaint, then quieted as she touched his cheek. "There's movement near the trail," she said. Cyrus paused. "You sure?" She nodded. "4 riders. Not from here." He set down the hammer slowly. Wehopa had not spoken of fear since winter. She had never named the men who raised her village. But sometimes her hands trembled at night, or her eyes sharpened at the snap of a branch. Cyrus knew enough to trust the shift in her voice. "They're not chasing yet," she added. "But they're looking." He wiped his hands on a rag. "We'll keep close to the cabin." That night, they lit no lantern. The fire burned low. Tahu slept curled in the drawer, unaware of how the world narrowed and bristled. Cyrus cleaned his rifle but left it beside the hearth. He didn't say aloud that he didn't want to use it. The silence said enough. Wehopa sat on the floor, her legs tucked beneath her, watching the flames. "They won't stop," she said. He nodded. "I saw the mark on one of their coats. It's railroad issue. Mercenaries, not law. They follow orders. No, she said softly. They follow coin. Her eyes gleamed in the firelight. Not afraid. Focused. They'll come here. If they find the trail. If someone talks. May won't. No. They sat without speaking for a long time. Cyrus finally said, "We can run." Wehopa shook her head. "Running is for when you have somewhere to go. We have a child. We have soil soft enough for planting." His hands clenched on his knees. "I won't let them take you. You can't stop death, Cyrus. But you can meet it standing." He looked at her then, and the fire caught the lines of his face. The old grief there. The gentleness carved around it like rings around a wound in wood. "I can try," he said. She stood and crossed to him, placed her hand on his shoulder. "You already have," she whispered. They slept in shifts for the next 2 days. Cyrus watched the tree line while Wehopa scouted beyond the ridges. She moved like a ghost, barefoot, leaving no sign. Tahu stayed with May during those hours, wrapped in a blue shawl and singing to himself in soft coos. On the third morning, the men came. There were 3 now. One had split off. They rode slowly, scanning the land with eyes that had seen too much and cared too little. They stopped near the fence post where Cyrus had been working the week before. He met them at the gate, calm, his coat buttoned against the wind. The lead rider was a tall man with a badge-shaped burn on his glove and a scar that pulled one eye into a permanent squint. "Afternoon," the man said, though there was no warmth in it. Cyrus nodded. "Looking for something?" "Someone." He didn't ask who. He knew. "We heard a Cheyenne woman pass through. Might have had a child with her. Dangerous sort. Government's offering good money." Cyrus's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. "You seen anything like that?" the man asked. Cyrus looked out toward the barn. The horses stirred, catching the scent of strangers. He let the silence settle before answering. "No." The squinting man studied him. "You live alone?" "Mostly." The third rider shifted in his saddle. "Funny thing. Neighbors said you've been buying extra grain. Cloth, too. Baby clothes." "Funny thing," Cyrus replied, "is neighbors not minding their damn business." The squinter's mouth curled. "We'll look around if you don't mind." "I do." "Not much of a choice." Cyrus's voice stayed level. "You got a warrant?" "Got a gun." Cyrus nodded slowly. "And I got a shovel. Used both in my time. Still prefer one over the other." The men didn't move. Then a fourth voice spoke from behind them. "Come." "Precise." "She's not here." They turned. Wehopa stood in the open, half-shadowed by the barn. She had a bough slung across her back, but her hands were empty. Tahu wasn't with her. Her expression was unreadable. The squinter raised an eyebrow. "You're a bold one." "I'm tired of running." He smiled thinly. "Good. Makes this easier." She walked forward slowly, stopping just behind Cyrus. "You want me," she said. "Then say it." The men looked between them. The third rider finally dismounted, stepping forward. "That child with you? He's not yours anymore. Government needs him. Something about keeping track. Settling bloodlines. Don't matter why." Wehopa didn't blink. "He's not a number." "You think that matters?" The second rider, younger than the others, looked uncomfortable. His horse shifted. He wasn't prepared for defiance. He wasn't prepared for her. "Take her now," the squinter ordered. The first rider stepped forward. That's when Cyrus moved. Not quickly, not with fury. Just a single step between her and them, like a man deciding, finally, where he belonged. "You cross that fence," he said. "You won't be walking out." His voice didn't rise, but it carried. The younger rider hesitated. "This ain't worth it, Clay. She's a fugitive. She's a mother." The squinter, Clay, snarled. You getting soft, Charlie? Charlie looked at Cyrus, then at Wehopa, then at the child's blanket draped over the line behind the cabin, drying in the sun. He stepped back. I ain't in this, he muttered. The other rider followed after a beat. Clay spat. Cowards. He reached for his pistol. Wehopa's hand moved like wind. Her bow was up before his fingers brushed the holster. An arrow sang. Not into his chest. Into the dirt by his boot. A warning, not a kill. Try again, she said, voice quiet. See what happens. Clay stared at them both. You people, he muttered. Then he turned and rode off alone. Silence fell like dust. Cyrus exhaled. Slowly. Wehopa stood still, bow at her side. Her face unreadable. You didn't kill him, Cyrus said. Not yet. He nodded. Thank you. She turned to him. I wasn't protecting myself. He met her eyes. I know. They walked back to the house together, hands brushing once in passing. May returned with Tahu an hour later. She looked at the arrow stuck in the yard, the footprints, the tension in the air, and simply said, Well then. She left them in peace. That evening, Cyrus sat beside the fire, rocking Tahu gently. Wehopa brewed tea with dried mint she had gathered weeks ago. She sat across from him, her gaze softer than before. I thought I'd have to kill again, she said. But you didn't. She nodded. He handed her the child. Their fingers touched. You're not alone anymore, he said. She looked down at the baby. No, I'm not. Outside, the sky darkened. The wind shifted again, warmer now. In the distance, frogs began to sing, timid at first, then bolder. Cyrus reached over, lifted her hand. You stay, he said. You're safe here. And for the first time since the snow, Wehopa smiled. The days warmed, then cooled again, as spring played its tug-of-war with the stubborn mountain cold. Here in the high country, the seasons didn't shift cleanly. They folded and unfolded like old letters, some pages wet with meltwater, others crisp with frost. The patch of snow beneath the old pine, the one where Wehopa had given birth, lingered longer than all the rest. Cyrus noticed at first how it refused to vanish, even as flowers bloomed around it. It stayed, not for lack of sun, but out of some deeper defiance, as though it remembered what had happened there and meant to keep vigil. Wehopa stood near it now, barefoot in the thawed grass, her toes half-cold from the wetness. She didn't shiver. Tahu, heavier now with weeks of milk and laughter, lay swaddled in a shawl across her chest. His eyelids fluttered with sleep. She watched the last bits of ice melt into the earth, heard the water soak into the roots beneath. It made her think of hearts, of how something so small could carry so much and still keep beating. Behind her, the cabin's chimney sent a soft curl of smoke into the sky. Cyrus was fixing the hinges on the barn door again. It was the third time he'd repaired them that month, though she suspected the door wasn't the problem. Some men needed things to mend. He joined her a moment later, kneeling beside the patch of snow. He touched the edge of it, let his fingers rest on the frozen slush. Then he sat back on his heels. Still won't go, he murmured. She didn't answer. He looked up at her. You think it's a sign? I think it remembers, she said. He smiled faintly. What? Pain? No, she said. Strength. A quiet passed between them, not heavy, but full. She reached down, took his hand. He held it without question. The child stirred, then settled again. They stayed there until the wind changed. It came from the west, dry and hard-edged, like something that carried bad news. Cyrus turned toward it, his expression shifting. What is it? She asked. Riders, he said. Two. Same kind of coats. Wehopa's eyes narrowed. She adjusted the shawl, securing Tahu against her tighter. Her movements were calm, practiced. Do we hide? She asked. No. We wait. They didn't speak again as they walked back to the cabin. Inside, Wehopa lit the lamp, though daylight still streamed through the windows. Cyrus set a pot of water on the stove, though neither of them planned to drink. There was something sacred in preparing normal things when the world threatened to crack open. They waited like that, not tense, but ready. The horses came into view near dusk. Dusty, tall geldings. The men astride them wore the same road-worn coats, same hard eyes, but they didn't come with their guns drawn. That was new. Cyrus stepped out first. Wehopa stood behind the door, bow in hand, not visible but close enough to end anything that needed ending. The first rider dismounted, stiff-legged, as if sore from too many miles. He wasn't young, but not old either. His beard was trimmed, his badge dulled with dust. "I'm looking for a woman," he said. "Cheyenne. Came through this area in winter." Cyrus met his gaze without blinking. "We get all kinds." The man nodded slowly. "I'm not looking for trouble. The ones before me, they were bounty men, not law. They weren't sent by anyone that matters now." Cyrus said nothing. The rider continued. "Word got around. About how she stood her ground. About how you stood with her. Some say she's dangerous." "She's a mother," Cyrus said flatly. "I know," the rider replied. "That's why I'm here. Not to take her. To warn her." A pause. "There's another group coming," the man said. "Different kind. Not mercenaries. Soldiers." Wehopa stepped out then, silent as a shadow. The rider turned but didn't flinch. He looked at her and did not smile, but something respectful passed across his face. "They think she's part of a rebellion," he said. "The boy, too. There's fear building in the cities. Fear of bloodlines. Of stories. Some people don't want peace. They want erasure." Wehopa's voice was low, but it cut clean. "What do you want?" "To make sure you don't get erased," he said. "I have people. Allies. They can move you. Safe places, far off. But you'd have to go soon." She didn't speak. Cyrus looked at her, then back at the man. "And if she stays?" The rider exhaled. "Then the next time someone comes, it won't be with words." He mounted his horse. "You've got a week. Maybe less. I'll come back once. After that, I can't promise anything." He turned the horse with a nudge and rode off, his partner trailing behind him like a fading thought. The night came on slow. Tahu cried once and was soothed. Wehopa stood at the window for a long time. Cyrus sat beside the fire, fingers tracing the rim of a mug gone cold. He broke the silence first. "We can go." Wehopa turned. "And keep running?" He met her gaze. "Or we can make a place where we don't have to." "You think that's possible?" "I think. I'd rather build something and fail than run and disappear." She crossed the room, sat beside him. "You would stay," she said softly. "I've already stayed." She looked into the fire. "Then we need to be ready." And so they were. The next days were filled with preparation. Quiet. Careful. They didn't speak of violence, but they sharpened tools, dug shallow trenches, hid supplies. May came by once with a shotgun and a sack of coffee. "I'm old," she said, "but not too old to choose my side." Wehopa kissed her cheek. They planted seeds on the fourth day. Carrots, potatoes, wild onions. Wehopa taught Cyrus how to press the soil without choking the roots. He taught her how to build a frame for the seedlings. Tahu watched from a sling, babbling. The sun was high when the riders came again. Not 2-6. They wore uniform coats, clean rifles slung across their backs, eyes hard and proud. They stopped just past the fence line, not dismounting. The man in front called out, "We have orders." Cyrus stepped forward. "Then disobey them." "Can't." "You can," Wehopa said, appearing from the barn with her bow slung. "You're just afraid." The man frowned. "This isn't about fear. This is about peace. Unity." Peace built on silence is just another kind of war. Don't make this harder, he said. You came to make it hard, Cyrus replied. We just live here. The officer raised a hand. I'll give you 5 minutes. Then we come in. Cyrus turned to Wehopa. Go. I'll hold the gate. I'm not leaving. He looked at her, anger rising. You have a child. I have a life, she said. And you're part of it now. She handed the baby to May, who stood beside the house, eyes already narrowed. If anything happens. I know, May said. The men began to move forward. Cyrus raised his rifle. Wehopa knocked an arrow. They didn't fire first. Not out of fear. Out of belief. And that made all the difference. Because as the soldiers stepped past the fence, something strange happened. The first man paused. Looked into Cyrus's eyes. Then at Wehopa. Then back at the child wrapped in blue behind them. He lowered his weapon. The others faltered. The officer turned. What are you doing? I didn't sign up for this, the soldier said. This ain't a war. It's a family. The others looked at each other. One by one, they lowered their guns. The officer's face twisted. You cowards! He reached for his sidearm. A single arrow hit the ground by his boot. I won't miss again, Wehopa said. He stared at her, at the child, at the quiet home behind them. Then he spat. This won't be the end of it. No, Cyrus said. It'll be the beginning. The officer turned his horse and rode away alone. The others stayed a moment longer. Then one, a boy not older than 20, dismounted and walked to Wehopa. He held out a small wooden token, a carving of a hawk. For the child, he said. Then he turned and followed the others. When the dust settled, when the silence wrapped around them again, Wehopa knelt beside the last patch of snow. It was gone. Only wet soil remained. She reached into it, planted her palm flat. Cyrus crouched beside her. Will they come back? Maybe. But we're still here. She smiled, the first full smile since the winter. Yes, she said. We are. And beneath their hands, the earth was warm. The pine tree at the center of the square stood stripped and shivering, bark peeled in places by time and weather. And to it, chained like some outlaw, or worse, stood the bride. Her veil had frozen stiff across her shoulders, catching ice in its netted threads. Her dress, too fine for weather like this, clung wet to her legs, now the color of old porcelain. Her hands were red, wrists blistered where the iron cuff bit flesh. The chain, no longer than a yard of rusted links, was fastened tight to the trunk, just above the notch where the preacher's wife had said she'd make a spectacle of sin for the good of the children. Her name was Nora, though no one said it now. They called her the girl, that woman, the shame. Her eyes stayed open, unblinking against the sting of snow, lashes rimmed in frost. She wasn't crying. Not anymore. She had done all that in the dark, before the town stirred, before the baker opened his shutters and children peered out with wide, questioning eyes. Someone had thrown a crust of bread by her feet. It had frozen solid. The sheriff had passed by earlier, muttering under his breath, claiming his hands were tied. He wouldn't look her in the eye. None of them did. Not even the man who had once asked for her hand, who now sat in the saloon drinking off the guilt like it was something that could be rinsed from the soul. Nora had been married, briefly. 2 weeks ago, she'd stood in the chapel beside James Fletcher, tall and proud and frowning like marrying her was some act of mercy. The preacher had started the words. Then James had interrupted, turned, and in front of everyone, spat the word liar. She's carrying another man's child, he said. And the silence that followed had been colder than this snow. She hadn't denied it. Not because it was true, but because her voice had caught in her throat. James had stepped away, shaken the dust from his boots like her dignity was something that clung, and walked out. The preacher stopped the ceremony. The town turned its back. Her own aunt refused her a room. The child inside her stirred, quiet still, like it was trying not to be seen. And in 2 days' time, Nora found herself chained to a tree for correction. A child cried across the square. His mother pulled him back, shushing him. Some folks passed by and shook their heads. Others whispered that she had brought it on herself, that decent women didn't end up pregnant before the wedding, no matter what she said. But Nora stood, feet numb, shoulders sagging but spine straight. The snow had painted her in pale grays, like a ghost. Yet her heart thudded with every breath. She was not broken. Not yet. It was just past morning when the boots came. Slow, deliberate. Not hurried like the postman. Not arrogant like the sheriff. These footsteps crunched with weight, with patience. Nora didn't lift her head. Not at first. She was used to passers-by now. But something about the way the wind shifted, the sudden hush, the pause in the air, made her look. He stood just beyond the tree line. Tall, maybe 35, but worn in the way men get when life has been a war. His coat was dusted in snow, wide-brimmed hat slanted low. A scar ran beneath his eye like a faded thread. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, really looked. Not with pity. Not with disgust. Like he was trying to place a name he once heard in a song. "You cold?" he asked, voice deep and calm. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her throat was cracked and dry, words long since frozen. He stepped closer. The town watched from windows. Curtains twitched. But he didn't seem to care. He shrugged off his coat, a thick buffalo hide thing, and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched, more from confusion than fear. The weight of it, the sudden warmth, made her eyes water. "No one's given you a coat?" he asked. Still no reply. She wasn't sure if this was real or if her mind was dreaming mercy. But then he knelt, slowly, knees sinking into snow. He reached up and cupped her frozen hand in his. His fingers were calloused. Gentle. "Name's Elijah," he said. "You don't need to tell me yours unless you want to." She stared at him, unsure. He didn't press her. Just sat there beside her, like the two of them were resting on a Sunday walk, not anchored to the heart of humiliation. After a long silence, she rasped, "Nora." He nodded once. Didn't smile. Just breathed the name like it mattered. "You hungry?" Again, she hesitated. But he'd already turned. From his satchel, he pulled out a tin cup and a small wrapped bundle. Steam rose when he uncorked a flask and poured warm broth into the cup. He held it out. She tried to grasp it, but her hands trembled. Without a word, he steadied it for her, let her sip. It tasted like something real. Chicken. Time. Hope. From across the square, the sheriff stepped out, adjusting his belt. "She ain't your concern, mister," he called. Elijah didn't look up. "She's someone's," he said, almost to himself. Then he stood, slow as always, and pulled a short blade from his boot. Nora tensed. But he didn't raise it. He simply leaned in, examined the iron shackle, and began working at the rusted lock. It took time. The thing had fused with cold and shame. But eventually, with a soft click, it gave. She stumbled. He caught her, arms strong but tender. Not like a man taking, but like someone steadying a wild bird. People were gathering now. A crowd forming. Not shouting, but watching. Like they didn't know what to do with this quiet rebellion. Elijah faced them. "This woman," he said, voice carrying without rising, "is my wife." Gasps flickered through the bystanders. "I said what I said," he continued, "and I'll be taking her home." The preacher's wife stormed forward. "She's a harlot. She's disgraced." Elijah turned to Nora, then back to the crowd. She was disgraced by a coward who left her in the snow. James Fletcher pushed his way forward then, mouth twisted. "You can't just take her." "I ain't taking," Elijah said, hand lightly resting on the small of Nora's back. "She's coming if she wants to." For the first time in days, Nora felt something unfurl inside her chest. Not safety. Not yet. but the suggestion of it, like the sun behind thick clouds. She looked up at Elijah, searching his face. There was no fire there, no demand, just a space being made for her to stand. "I want to," she said, voice shaking but certain. He helped her step forward. The chain clinked once, then was gone. The snow fell lighter now, the wind still cruel, but bearable. As they walked away, Nora leaned into his side, not because she was weak, but because it felt right to do so. Behind them, the town stood silent. No one called out. No one stopped them. And though no one realized it then, the first crack had formed in the town's hard, frozen shell. A small, steady warmth had begun to spread. Nora did not look back. The cabin sat at the edge of the woods like a secret whispered by the trees. It wasn't much, a single room with a sloped roof, stone chimney leaning slightly from years of storms, and a door that creaked like it remembered every sorrow ever to cross its threshold. Smoke curled from the chimney into the pale afternoon sky, trailing upward like a promise not yet made. Inside, it was warmer than Nora had expected, not just from the stove, which crackled with cedar logs, but from the way the space felt lived in without being hardened. Elijah led her in without speaking, only pausing to unhook the latch and kick snow from his boots. He offered no grand gesture, no sweeping declaration of safety. He simply helped her over the threshold, kept a steadying hand on her back as she stepped over the worn rug, and guided her to sit on a pinewood chair softened with sheepskin. Nora didn't speak either. The coat he'd given her was heavy across her shoulders, damp at the hem, fragrant with something that reminded her of tobacco and juniper. She didn't ask what this place was to him. The fire said it all. He'd built this. Not just the cabin, but the silence inside it. It was the silence of a man who had been alone for a long time, and who had made peace with it. He handed her a blanket, thick and coarse, and turned back to the stove. His movements were simple, efficient. A pan scraped gently against metal. Water poured from a jug. The smell of beans and onion rose soon after, followed by a faint hiss of steam. She watched him from the chair, unsure what to say. He moved like someone who once knew violence, but had chosen stillness. Not out of weakness, but choice. When he finally spoke, it was not to ask questions or press her. "You'll be sore," he said, placing a wooden bowl into her hands, "from the cold, from standing too long." His voice was deeper indoors, less cut by wind, like something buried in the earth. "Eat what you can. I ain't much of a cook, but it'll do." She murmured thanks, voice hoarse. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the bowl. The heat seeped into her palms, and she cradled it close. Each spoonful was plain but grounding. No spices, just the simplicity of sustenance. Still, it brought tears to her eyes, not from taste, but from the shocking kindness of it. No one had fed her in days. When she finished, she placed the bowl beside her. Elijah took it without ceremony and washed it in the metal basin by the window. The sun had slipped low, setting the edge of the sky on fire. Orange light spilled across the snow outside, glowing faint through the frosted glass. "You want to sleep," he said, not asking. She nodded. He pointed to the bed, a single cot tucked near the back wall. The quilt atop it was faded, hand-stitched. "Take it. I'll be by the door if you need anything." She looked from the bed to him. "Where will you sleep?" He shrugged, lifting a wool blanket from a trunk. "I've slept in worse places." She hesitated. "You don't have to give me everything." His eyes met hers. "You've had everything taken." That was the first time she truly saw him. Not just the stranger with the coat, but the man behind the quiet. He wasn't trying to rescue her. He wasn't saving her to feel righteous. He was just someone who couldn't watch a woman freeze in the middle of town and walk by. That kind of man didn't need to be explained. He just was. The bed was softer than she expected. As she lay beneath the quilt, the warmth soaked into her bones. The room quieted. She could hear Elijah moving, setting a kettle on the stove, oiling something she couldn't see. Then his steps slowed. The chair near the door creaked under his weight. She closed her eyes. The snow kept falling outside. And inside, For the first time in days, she slept. Morning came in pale blue light. The air smelled of coffee and bread. Nora stirred beneath the quilt, unsure where she was at first. Then she saw the pine walls, the low-beamed ceiling, the corner stove, and remembered. Elijah was already up. He sat near the window, cup in hand, watching the snow fall as if it were some scripture only he could read. He turned when she moved, gave a short nod. "There's coffee, if you want." She sat up slowly, muscles aching but no longer frozen. "I'd like some." He poured it into a tin cup and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. She noticed how steady his hands were, how he moved with no wasted motion. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. He shook his head. "Didn't need to." She sipped. The coffee was strong, unrefined, but real, like everything else about him. They sat in silence a while. It wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that follows disaster, where words haven't returned yet, and the soul is still sweeping ash from its corners. Eventually, he spoke. "Folks'll be talking today." She stared at her cup. "Let them." He nodded. "Still, if you want to stay a while, I don't mind." Nora looked at him then, truly looked. "Why did you say I was your wife?" He didn't answer immediately. He set his cup down, leaned back in the chair. His eyes, pale gray-green, softened. "Because they wouldn't have let you leave with dignity otherwise. And I figured if they needed a name to swallow their pride, I'd give them one." She swallowed. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." "You don't know what they said about me." "I heard what mattered." "And if it were true?" she asked, voice trembling slightly. "If I really was carrying another man's child?" He met her gaze. "Then you were still left in the cold." That part didn't change. Her eyes burned. She looked away. Elijah leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I used to ride with men who didn't flinch at watching others suffer. I've seen towns burn, seen women hung for less than what you endured. I walked away from that life. Not because I got soft, but because I got tired of watching the world turn cruel." He paused. "What they did to you wasn't just cruel. It was cowardly." Nora's hands trembled. She clutched the coffee tighter to stop them. He sat back again. "So if my name buys you peace, take it. No strings. You don't owe me anything." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any duration. No expectations. No demands. Just decency, offered like bread. She stood, walked slowly to the window and stared out. Snow dusted the edge of the porch. 2 birds flitted in the bare branches. Somewhere in town, someone would be lighting a stove, muttering about her, cursing Elijah's name too. But out here, there was only stillness. And the man who had chosen not to look away. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't answer. But his presence said enough. Days passed like melted snow, slow and quiet. Nora stayed. Not because she was afraid to leave, but because her soul needed stillness. Elijah didn't push her. He went about his work, splitting wood, mending the roof, hunting for rabbits. In the evenings, he sat with her by the fire, sometimes whittling, sometimes reading from an old leather book of poems. She found herself talking more. First about small things, where she'd grown up, what kind of tea she liked, a memory of her mother singing during spring planting. Then deeper truths surfaced. How James had courted her. How she'd felt safe with him, until the day she told him the truth. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said one night. "I trusted someone. A friend of my brother's. He was kind, until he wasn't." Elijah didn't move. "I told James before the wedding. I thought he'd understand. He said he forgave me. Then, at the altar." Her voice broke. Elijah didn't touch her, didn't intrude. But she felt the air shift around him, like a great sorrow had opened beneath the surface. "They said I seduced the man. That I was wild, loose. The women turned first. Then the men. My aunt said she couldn't house shame under her roof. She stared into the fire. And then I was just nothing. No one. Elijah stirred. Not much. Just enough to say he was listening. You're not no one, he said at last. She looked at him, eyes wet. Then who am I? He met her gaze. Someone who survived. Someone who deserves better. The words weren't magic. They didn't erase pain. But they rooted something in her. A seed of belief that hadn't existed before. That night, she stood at the threshold of the cabin while he set out another blanket on the chair. The wind had calmed. Snowflakes drifted like whispers across the sky. She turned. Why don't you take the bed tonight? He shook his head. I'm fine. I want you to. He hesitated. You sure? She nodded. You've done enough. He gave a faint smile, small, but real. All right then. She turned away, heart thudding. Not from fear. From something older, quieter. Trust. The next morning, the world felt different. Brighter. Not in light, but in clarity. Nora stepped onto the porch and stared across the snow blanket toward town. She knew the world hadn't changed. There were still cruel people in Clearwater. Still whispers. Still shame. But she wasn't alone anymore. And that made everything different. Elijah stepped beside her. They stood in silence for a moment, sharing breath in the cold. I'll go into town later, he said. Nora looked at him. Why? Need supplies. And people need to see your name ain't one they get to bury. She hesitated. What if they come for me again? He turned to her, eyes steady. Then they'll meet a man who don't walk away. She felt her chest rise with something that felt like courage. Or hope. Maybe both. I'll go with you, she said. He studied her face. You sure? She nodded. If I don't stand beside the man who stood for me, what kind of woman would I be? He smiled then, truly smiled. And for a moment, the snow seemed to pause around them. Together, they stepped down from the porch, boots crunching into the whiteness. The wind tugged gently at her shawl, but she didn't feel cold. She felt seen. And though the town waited beyond the trees, filled with all its petty cruelties and rusted judgments, she walked toward it with a man who had looked at her, not like a fallen woman, but like someone worth rising for. The days unfolded slowly in the hollow of that snow-fringed world, one breath-soft morning at a time. The wind still hissed through the pines, and the town still whispered behind cupped hands, but Nora no longer lived beneath their shadow. The cabin became her rhythm, its walls absorbing her silence, its hearth stitching warmth into her once frozen limbs. The hurt she carried did not vanish. It softened, became a weight that could be set down piece by piece without fear of it being stolen. Each morning, she woke to the sound of Elijah chopping wood. Not violently. His axe fell with precision, each strike like a heartbeat that steadied the world around her. She'd lie under the quilt a few minutes longer, listening, letting the rhythm settle into her chest before rising to tend to the small tasks he'd left undone, warming the kettle, folding the blanket he used in the chair, sweeping the pine needles that found their way in through the threshold. She wasn't beholden to these acts. No one expected them. But there was a comfort in their quiet return. He rarely spoke unless needed, but his presence filled the room like the scent of cedar. When he did speak, it was never loud. His voice moved like creek water, low and patient. He would ask how she slept, offer her coffee or the last slice of pan-fried cornbread, and sometimes leave a book on the table without explanation, a well-worn volume of Whitman or a faded copy of Psalms, pages feathered with use. Nora, once a schoolteacher before all the shame had taken her name from the ledger, found herself reading again. Her fingers, raw and stiff just a week ago, now turned pages slowly, tracing lines of poetry like threads of her own buried voice. Sometimes she read aloud, soft enough that her voice barely reached past the fire. Elijah didn't always respond, but he'd pause in his whittling or glance her way from the table, and she'd know he was listening. Healing came in odd shapes. Not in grand narrations or sweeping recoveries, but in things like combing her hair without wincing. In sleeping through the night. In laughing, quietly, unexpectedly, when Elijah made a dry remark about the owl who kept tapping on the roof beam like it owned the place. They didn't speak about the past much. Not hers. Not his. But traces came through, as if they trusted the silences to do most of the speaking. One evening, as the snow thickened into a curtain across the windows, Nora sat mending a tear in her sleeve while Elijah stirred a pot of venison stew. The fire flickered against his profile, outlining the shadow of an old wound across his jaw. She watched him a moment before asking, "What made you stop?" He didn't look up. "Stop what?" "Being what you were before." He stirred slower, then set the ladle aside. "There was a boy. 14, maybe. Too young to have a pistol. Too quick with his mouth. Thought calling me out would make him a man." Her needle paused. "I shot him before I knew what I was doing," Elijah said, voice low. "Not because I wanted to. Because it was habit." Silence fell again. This one heavier. "And after?" she asked gently. "I put my gun in the river and walked till I found a place where no one asked me what I'd done." He turned to face her. Clearwater was quiet. "I thought I could keep my name low, trade labor for peace. Turns out, peace don't come unless you're willing to defend it for someone else." Nora's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "Don't be. That boy. He reminds me to keep my hands open." They ate in silence after that, not because the words were done, but because enough had been said for one night. Later, as the coals dimmed and the wind picked up, she hesitated by the cot. Elijah was already settling into the chair, his blanket folded across his lap. "You know," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "you could sleep in the bed." He glanced up, brow furrowed. "I mean," she added quickly, "just for a night. It's warmer, and we both know that chair's older than either of us." He smiled faintly but didn't move. "I appreciate it. But you need it more." "I don't think I do, not anymore." He studied her. "It's not about who needs it." "Then what is it about?" He hesitated. "It's about not crossing lines you haven't drawn." Nora stood still. The fire cracked behind her. She nodded. "Thank you." That night, she slept soundly, knowing the man who sat near the door wasn't guarding her like a possession, but like a prayer he dared not say aloud. As winter thickened, they ventured further. Once a week, Elijah would saddle his horse and ride into town, bringing back flour, salt, the occasional letter he never opened. Nora went with him only once. Faces turned as she walked Clearwater's main road, shoulders straight, chin lifted. Some women looked away. A few stared too long. But she didn't flinch. She stood beside Elijah at the mercantile, fingers wrapped around the small list she'd written in careful script. When Mrs. Hanley tried to ignore her, Elijah said simply, "She's buying sugar." "That's not a crime last I checked." The sugar was handed over. That night, they shared biscuits sweetened slightly at the edges. Nora laughed for the first time in weeks, and Elijah nearly smiled wide enough to show his teeth. Not everything was easy. Some days Nora woke with the memory of chains heavy on her chest. She would sit on the porch with her knees pulled up, staring into the trees, fists clenched. Elijah never interrupted. He'd bring her tea. Sit near. Say nothing. Let her fight the ghosts at her own pace. She grew to love him for that. And slowly, the space between them changed. He began brushing the snow from her shoulders without asking. She began folding his shirts, lining them along the narrow shelf. They sat closer at the table. Her fingers lingered a second longer when passing him tools. His eyes followed her a little longer when she spoke. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the kindling of something that could hold warmth. One morning, while hanging clothes on the line behind the cabin, Nora felt a kick inside her. Sharp, insistent. She gasped, hand flying to her belly. Elijah was chopping wood nearby. He turned at the sound. She smiled at him. It kicked. He set the axe down, wiping his hands on his trousers. "May I?" She nodded, and he stepped forward, tentative, almost reverent. His hand was warm against the curve of her belly. He waited. The child kicked again, and his expression shifted. Not surprise, not joy, but something more solemn. "She's strong," he said softly. Nora blinked. "You think it's a girl?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "Seems right." For a moment, they just stood there, breath misting in the cold, hands touching over the life between them. "I've been thinking about names," Nora said. He didn't respond, but she could tell he was listening. "I like Hope." He nodded. "Hope's good." She watched him, heart stammering. "Do you want to be part of this? I mean, truly." Elijah's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't want to make you feel beholden." "You don't." He looked at her, snow falling soft into his beard. "Then yes. If you'll have me." Nora stepped closer. "I already do." No kiss followed. No grand gesture. Just a shared breath in the cold, a hush that made the world tilt slightly toward spring. That night, she lay in bed while Elijah moved around the cabin, banking the fire, checking the lock on the door. She watched him as one might watch the sky before a storm. Curious, respectful, aware of the power beneath the surface. "Elijah," she said. He turned. "I'm not afraid anymore." He didn't smile, but his eyes shone. "Then we're doing something right." She reached a hand toward him. He came slowly, as if unsure the invitation was real. When he took her hand, she squeezed it, then let go. They didn't sleep in the same bed that night, but the distance between cot and chair felt smaller than ever. Morning brought a thin light and the quiet drip of thaw from the eaves. The snow wasn't gone, not yet, but it had softened. The first signs of melt whispered beneath the crust, promising a change that came not in storms, but in steady warmth. Nora sat by the window, the quilt around her shoulders. Elijah brewed coffee. Neither of them spoke. But something had shifted, and neither of them would be the same. By the time spring whispered through the trees, melting the snow in patches along the hillside, Nora had grown used to the hush that surrounded Elijah's land. It was a silence full of presence, not absence. The wind no longer howled like it used to. It sighed now, softer, weaving through budding branches and rippling the thawing creek just beyond the clearing. The world was waking, and so was she. Every day, her steps grew steadier. She moved with more ease, belly round beneath her apron, hands steady as she tended the hearth or folded clean linens. Her voice no longer caught in her throat when she spoke of the baby, and her laughter no longer felt foreign. There were still moments, quiet shadows that crept in at dusk, memories that clung like smoke, but they came less often, and when they did, she had learned to breathe through them. Elijah's presence made it easier. He didn't try to fix what hurt. He just stayed, a mountain in her storm. The townsfolk had started talking again, not with the same cruel venom they once wielded, but with a grudging or reserve for things they couldn't explain. Nora, the girl they had left to freeze, was still alive, still standing. And she walked beside Elijah now, chin lifted, hands cradling new life like a badge no one could tarnish. The man who had once disappeared from their memory had become her shield, her shadow, and, though unspoken, her home. So when James Fletcher returned, dust-covered and smug, riding into town like he'd never been gone, the quiet they'd built cracked like ice in spring. It began with whispers. A rider spotted on the southern road. A coat too fine for a drifter. A pistol at his side, clean and polished. Some said he'd come back for revenge, others claimed it was guilt. But Nora felt the shift before anyone spoke it aloud. That evening, Elijah stood longer at the edge of the woods, watching the road without pretending to. His jaw was tight, and though he didn't say it, Nora knew. The next morning, they walked into town together. Nora wore her blue shawl, the one Elijah had mended with thread the same color as her eyes. The baby shifted beneath her ribs, restless with the rhythm of her steps. Elijah's hand stayed near her back, guiding without pushing. They had meant only to visit the general store, but the moment they crossed the threshold of the street, the atmosphere turned thick. James stood outside the saloon. He looked older, somehow. Not in the face, but in the hollowness behind his eyes. Like the guilt had eaten more than time ever could. His boots were dusty, his hat cocked with the same arrogance he'd worn the day he left Nora at the altar. But his eyes, when they landed on her, flinched. "Elijah," he said, voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Didn't expect to see you still in town." Elijah didn't stop walking, but his steps slowed. Nora placed a hand on his arm. James turned his gaze to her. "Nora." She met it without faltering. "I heard you been calling her your wife," James said. "Funny, seeing as I left her unclaimed." The words hung heavy. A few townsfolk paused in their errands, lingering by doors and wagons. Nora didn't blink. "You didn't leave me unclaimed, James. You left me unkind." Murmurs stirred. A boy dropped a sack of grain and didn't bother to pick it up. James stepped forward. "You carrying my child, and yet you wear another man's name." "It was never your child," she said, voice level. "You knew that. You just didn't care." James scoffed. "Even if it wasn't mine, it was your shame." Elijah took one step forward. Not fast. Not threatening. Just enough to bring quiet. "It was your cowardice that shamed her," he said. "Not the child. Not the truth." James's jaw twitched. "You planning to play father, then? Raise another man's mistake?" Nora stepped between them. Her voice did not rise, but it rang with something that held the crowd still. "She is not a mistake," she said. "She's the reason I kept breathing when the world chained me to a tree." Someone gasped. It might have been the preacher's daughter. Nora's hand found Elijah's. "She'll be born into a home where truth matters more than pride. Where kindness isn't weakness." James looked like he wanted to speak, but the words curdled behind his teeth. The pistol on his hip glinted. He glanced at Elijah, then at the people gathered. No one moved. "I could claim her now," he said suddenly, desperate. "Marry you. Make it right." "You don't get to rewrite what you ruined," Elijah said, tone calm. "She gave you her trust. You spit on it." James's hand moved toward his gun. Elijah didn't reach for his. Nora stepped closer to James. "If you raise that pistol, you're not proving you're a man. You're proving you're still the boy who left a woman to die in the snow." Her words landed like a slap. For a breath, James's fingers hovered over the grip. Then he stepped back, exhaling like the air had betrayed him. The sheriff pushed through the crowd then, finally deciding to play his part. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, voice edged with warning. "Might be time you rode on." James stared at Nora for a long moment, as if trying to find the girl he once knew in the woman who stood before him. But she was no longer there. The girl he'd scorned had burned in the frost. What remained was ash turned to iron. He turned and mounted his horse. No one stopped him. No one waved. As he rode out of town, Nora felt Elijah's hand find hers again. Not as a shield this time. As a vow. They turned toward the churchyard, not because they owed anyone faith, but because Nora needed to breathe in the space that once tried to bury her. The pine tree still stood at the center of the square. It had changed little, bark scarred, trunk lean, but it no longer loomed. It waited. Nora stepped toward it, her feet slow but certain. "Elijah," she said quietly, "this is where it ended." He stood beside her. "Then let's make it where something begins." She reached into the pocket of her shawl and pulled out a small ribbon. The same one that had once tied her hair on the day she was to be married. She tied it to a low branch. The breeze caught it, lifted it gently. "I thought this place would haunt me forever," she whispered. "Now it bears your name," Elijah replied. She turned to him. "Not yet." His brow furrowed. Nora smiled. "You called me your wife. I want it to be true." He stilled. The crowd had dispersed. Only the wind remained. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm sure." There were no bells, no gowns, no preacher. Just two people standing where cruelty had once stood taller. Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out a ring. Simple, silver, worn. "This was my mother's," he said. She never had much, but she said love's worth didn't shine. It stayed. He slipped it onto her finger. Her hands were trembling now, not from fear, but from the enormity of peace. Nora, he said, you are my home. She breathed in sharply. And you are my shelter. They kissed, not with heat, but with the reverence of survivors who'd found something worth trusting. A few townsfolk watched from windows. No one interrupted. No one dared. Later, as they walked back to the cabin, the sky turned gold along the horizon. The sun dipped low, and the air smelled of thawing earth. They crossed the threshold together. Inside, the fire still burned. And for the first time, Nora laid her hand against her belly and said, without fear, "We're safe now." Elijah stood behind her, arms around her shoulders. She leaned into him. The past had not been erased. The names thrown at her would never fully fade. But new ones had taken root. Wife, mother, hope. They stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching the sky fall into stars. Tomorrow would come. And when it did, they'd be ready, not because the world had softened, but because they had become stronger than its cruelty. Ashes still clung to memory. But from ashes, new names rose. The spring came slow that year, like it was afraid of disturbing what winter had left behind. It crept in under the eaves and into the bones of the cabin, melted the last of the ice from the edge of the roof, and coaxed life from places where all had once seemed still. Buds appeared on the trees like promises whispered by the earth. Birds returned, hesitant at first, then with the full conviction of creatures who'd survived more winters than they cared to count. Nora stood on the porch, her belly full and low now, wrapped in the pale shawl Elijah had mended again for her. She rested one hand on the worn post, the other on the small of her back, watching the meadow unfurl into green. The wind brushed her hair back from her face, not cruel anymore, but curious. It carried the scent of thawing soil, of pine, of something like freedom. Behind her, Elijah moved quietly in the kitchen, boiling water for tea, slicing the last of the dried apples. He whistled under his breath, low, tuneless, content. He'd always said little, but what he did say stayed. When she first came to his door, he had offered no questions, no demands, only his name. Now, months later, he had offered her everything. His home, his steadiness, his name. The cabin had changed. It held more color now. Nora had stitched curtains from an old dress, and he'd carved shelves for her books, placing them with a kind of reverence that made her throat tighten. The cradle he'd built sat near the hearth, smooth and strong. She'd found him one evening smoothing the last of the wood with his hands like he was trying to memorize it. When she asked if it was finished, he said quietly, "It's ready whenever she is." The baby hadn't come yet, but Nora felt her nearing. Each breath pulled more space into her ribs, more ache into her hips. But she was not afraid. She had walked through pain alone once. This time, she would walk through it with a hand she could hold. That morning, Elijah stepped out onto the porch beside her. He carried a mug and handed it to her without a word. She took it, grateful. The warmth seeped into her palms. He stood beside her in silence, both of them looking out at the field where grass was beginning to rise. "Looks like rain," he said finally. She nodded. "The good kind." "Yeah." She sipped, then asked, "Do you think we'll ever be free of it?" He didn't ask what she meant. He rarely did. "The past," he said. "Or the people who won't forget it?" "Both." He took a long breath. "The world doesn't forget. But sometimes it forgives, if you teach it how." She turned toward him, touched his arm. "You did." He looked at her then, really looked. "No, you did." Later that day, she returned to the tree. Not alone. Elijah walked beside her, one hand on the small of her back, steadying her as the dirt road dipped and climbed. The town was quiet when they entered, quieter than it had ever been. Maybe because folks had finally learned that silence was sometimes a form of respect. Or maybe because the story of a woman surviving what Nora had could only end two ways, and hers was the one they hadn't expected. The pine tree stood just as it had months ago, roots tangled in memory, trunk marred by old scars. But the chain was gone. The ground around it had thawed, and a small patch of wildflowers bloomed near the base. She didn't know who planted them. Perhaps no one. Perhaps the earth remembered, too, and offered what it could. Nora took Elijah's hand and stepped forward. This was where it had begun. Her public humiliation, her near undoing. But she felt no fear now. No tremble in her chest, no shame in her breath. She stood tall, round with child, ring on her finger, husband at her side. She untied the ribbon from the low branch. It had faded in the sun, pale now, its ends frayed. She held it between her fingers for a moment, then folded it into her palm. "It's time," she said. Elijah nodded once. They walked together to the edge of town, where the preacher stood waiting by the field. He had asked no questions when Nora sent word. Just nodded. Said he'd be there. Behind him stood half the town, faces Nora had grown used to avoiding. But now, they looked at her differently. Not with pity. Not with the fear that cruelty brings. But with something quieter. Curiosity. Respect. Some even with guilt. Nora and Elijah stood beneath the open sky. No chapel, no altar. Just wild grass beneath their feet and the sun trying to break through thick clouds above. There was no speech, no sermon. Just two hands meeting, two eyes locking. "I don't want words to make this," Nora said. "I want truth." Elijah nodded. "Then speak it." She looked at him. "You saw me when I was broken. You didn't try to fix me. You just held what was left until I could stand again." Elijah's voice was barely more than a breath. "You made me lay down every gun I ever carried, just by standing." She smiled. "Do you take me?" "I already have." The preacher stepped forward, his voice quiet. "You've made your vows in the sight of the Lord and those who remember. You are husband and wife." The crowd didn't cheer. But they didn't walk away, either. Some clapped softly. A few wept. And one little girl stepped forward with a daisy in her hand and gave it to Nora. She tucked it behind her ear, tears threatening. Elijah placed his hand gently on her belly. "Soon," he said. That night, the wind shifted. The sky broke open, and the rain came, not angry, but strong. It beat on the roof like a drum, filled the rain barrel to its brim, sang against the windows. Nora woke before dawn, breath caught, one hand on her stomach. "Elijah," she whispered, sitting up. He rose instantly, already beside her. "It's time." She nodded, face pale, hands shaking, but not from fear. He helped her to the chair, built the fire higher, fetched the clean cloths and the water they'd been boiling every day for weeks. Everything was ready. But it was her steadiness that surprised him most. The way she breathed through the pain, the way she leaned into it, not as punishment, but as passage. Hours passed. The storm outside raged, but inside, the cabin pulsed with another kind of storm, rhythmic, ancient, raw. Nora clenched the sides of the bed. Elijah wiped her brow, held her when the pain bent her forward, whispered soft things even she couldn't hear through the roar in her ears. When the child came, it was with a cry that filled the room and shook the silence from every rafter. A girl. Strong-lunged. Red-faced. Perfect. Nora laughed and wept all at once. Elijah placed the child into her arms. She stared down at the tiny face, the fingers that opened and closed as if holding secrets from another world. "Hope," she whispered. Elijah sat beside her, arm around her shoulders, lips against her temple. "You carried her," he said, voice husky. "She carried me," Nora replied. The storm passed. Morning came. The cabin glowed with the scent of new life and firewood. Outside, the tree swayed gently in the wind. They buried the old ribbon beneath its roots and planted daffodils in its place. The town spoke of her with new words now. Some still whispered, but others spoke her name with reverence. They said she survived a storm the town created, that she rose from ashes without bitterness, that she gave her daughter the name she herself had once needed, and that when the wind blew just right through the fields outside Clearwater, you could hear a woman's laugh there, soft, free. The wind carried her name, and it always would.